I'm super excited to share this special bonus episode of the podcast. It's an interview with Rhian Jones and Lucy Heyman. They're the authors of this great new book titled Sound Advice: The Ultimate Guide to a Healthy and Successful Career in Music.
Well, if we've spoken about many times on the podcast, the music industry is experiencing a mental health crisis, with musicians in particular facing significant mental and physical health issues. Mm-hmm. In the past, artists were really only tasked with writing, recording, touring, and doing some press. Today, on top of all that, they now have social media footprint, short-form video, streaming, merch, YouTube, content creation, crowdfunding, etc., etc. It can be absolutely overwhelming.
In this book, they lay out some ways of empowering those who work in the music industry with some tools that will help them manage and prioritize their career and their health. The music business is complex by design. You know, we talk about this all the time. Masters versus publishing, labels versus distribution, roles and responsibilities of managers, booking agents, lawyers, publicists. Rhian and Lucy, they talk about those challenges mixed in with some great advice on how to stay healthy mentally and physically.
So now, without further ado, here are Rhian Jones and Lucy Heyman, authors of Sound Advice: The Ultimate Guide to a Healthy and Successful Career in Music. I love to say this. Let's let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand! Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air. On the air. On the air. On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Rhian, Lucy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
The music industry is experiencing a mental health crisis, with musicians in particular facing significant mental and physical health issues. Your book lays out some ways of empowering those who work in the music industry and some tools that will help them manage and prioritize their own health. Let's talk about some of those.
Yeah, to start, thanks so much for having us. It's great to be here. I think when we wrote the book, one of the things we wanted to do was to give overarching guidance to people and say, okay, this is what you can do to stay healthy. This is what you can do to thrive and to, optimize your performance. And one of the things that we found when we looked at the research was that, yeah, there were some overarching things, but everyone is so different. And I think one of the key takeaways that we both found from the book was what's really important is to know yourself and know what your weak points are. And make sure that you know what you need in order to overcome any issues, and you communicate that to your team around you. So it might be, for example, that if you have some mental health challenges, you can say to the people around you, hey guys, listen, one of the things that goes wrong is X. And you might see me starting to do this, and at this point, maybe you could gently remind me or something, whatever the situation is for each person. But I think that self-awareness is really, really important in order to try and prevent issues.
Yeah, and I would add to that you also need a supportive team, of course, and the support of the wider industry, which definitely does seem like it's coming. There are various initiatives at major labels and management companies that are designed to better look after the health of the artists that they're working with. it's a bit too early to say whether those have been effective yet. It's still a very high pressure job. And as Lucy says, every artist situation is kind of unique to itself. But yeah, it's, of course, half of it is definitely knowing yourself, but it's essential that you're working with people who respect those needs and are able to facilitate the kind of environment that you need to thrive, which maybe more often than not still isn't the case.
Before we hit record, we talked a little bit about performance health. What is performance health?
So performance health is basically all the things that go together to make an artist's performance optimal. So you can see it in two ways. One is like injury prevention. So looking at things like musculoskeletal health, vocal health, hearing health, trying to prevent problems. But then we also look at things like how you can sort of optimize your voice, or actually optimize playing posture for maximum ease so that you can get into a flow state more easily. All of these things. And then there's a whole field of performance psychology that looks at things like, trying to get over issues. So overcoming things like performance anxiety and perfectionism, but then optimizing performance, like how to actually manage being on stage, and actually how you then adapt to changing stage environments, sizes. If it's a TV recording, all these different contexts can cause different issues for artists.
Yeah, it's not really talked about enough. And all of my artists that are on the road have these challenges, whether it's mental health, physical health, the voice. Touring is hard. It's hard to eat healthy on the road. It's a very difficult life.
Yeah, it is. And in the book, obviously I said you need to know yourself and where your weak points are, and work out ways to look after yourself and communicate things. But obviously there are those like the pillars of good health, aren't there? So there's like, eating good food, getting enough sleep, I'm trying to think, communicating with loved ones, all of this kind of thing, exercise. And I think just taking some time before you get on tour, before the kind of whirlwind starts, to plan, okay, how am I going to be healthy for this tour? And the research shows that if you want to have a healthy habit, it helps to put the healthy habit in place like 3 or 4 weeks before you start the transition to a new phase. So for anyone on tour, like if you want to start eating healthily, if you want to have an exercise regime, like start it 2 or 3 weeks before the tour, and then it's really easy to carry it in. Because I think people think, right, when I'm on tour, I'm going to have a health kit. But there's so much change happening that it's quite difficult to then incorporate another change into your routine.
The music business is complex by design. We talk about this all the time. Masters versus publishing, labels and distributors, roles and responsibilities of managers, booking agents, lawyers, publicists, etc. How did you approach laying all of this out in your book?
In what is hopefully as simple and concise a way as possible. We were very clear about the fact that this is not a book that focuses on the structure of the music business. Like there's many books out there, including, Donald Passman's, Anne Harrison's, that do a brilliant job of that in a lot of depth. And what we really wanted to do was do one that focused on the health side of things. But of course, it's really important to understand the structure of the business and what those different team members do in order to kind of feel secure and reduce stress in the job as a musician. So we do have a chapter called Business Basics, which gives an overview of the structure of the music business, the various different companies that a musician might be working with, and the various different roles of team members that they might be working with. We also cover areas like diversity, and we delve into some stats on what that looks like. And we also have like a box on copyright and cover how a song has 2 separate rights. There are all of things like collection societies, key things to keep in mind. We've got some really good quotes there from a lawyer called Liv Lyons, who talks a lot about things to keep in mind when signing deals. And then we also, of course, touch upon the responsibility of all of those involved in an artist team to look after their health.
Yeah, I think by being on top of those things that you just mentioned, that will reduce the stress and pressure and help with the mental well-being as well. Talk about what you learned about diversity in the music industry and tell our listeners about neurodiversity.
I would just start that we didn't really go into great detail about neurodiversity in the book because there were so many other topics that we wanted to look at. And in the UK, Universal had just published a really good neurodiversity in the music business guide. So we didn't want to replicate that. Having said that, I do a lot of work with artists one-to-one, and I'd say in the last few years, about 50% of them are saying they've got an ADHD diagnosis or other neurodiverse diagnoses. And it's really fascinating because I feel like we're suddenly starting to talk about this in a way that we haven't done in the past. And it makes sense because obviously one of the upsides of ADHD, for example, is amazing creative abilities. But it also means that, so for artists that makes sense, but it also means that there is this huge cohort of artists and potentially executives who are not being supported with very similar challenges. And I think maybe that's the next stage in terms of like how we support the music business. It's really addressing to what extent is neurodiversity an issue, and how do we actually support everyone who is struggling with symptoms of it?
Do you feel like there's less of a stigma attached to it now?
I do. I have ADHD, and I'm very happy to disclose that. I think there's more understanding now, isn't there? Before, especially in the UK, before it was always thought to be that it was a problem affecting small children, often boys, and it was very hyperactive children running around in the classroom. And there's been so much more awareness now of how it's different in women. It presents very differently in women. And if you have someone with autism and ADHD as a woman, that's going to look different again. And I think it's it's really empowered a lot of women to actually feel like some of the problems they face are not issues of their own personality. It's not a sort of like, well, that's me just being useless. That actually, okay, this is fine. These are things, it's totally normal that I struggle with this thing. And actually, maybe there are things I can put in place to support it. And I'm not going to beat myself up anymore. And actually, I'll look at some of the positive aspects of being neurodiverse and look at how I can actually sculpt my life or career around the things that come easily to me.
It ties back to the thing that Lucy was saying at the beginning, which is, knowing yourself and knowing your needs. And if you're aware that you are neurodiverse, then you can try and make sure that your working life is set up in a way that supports that.
You also talk about the importance of money management, something that doesn't get talked about enough. What advice would you give a developing artist when it comes to their finances?
Be aware of how the business works, first of all. Get an idea, like we said earlier, of the structure and of the team members and of where money is coming from and how. Don't leave money on the table. Be on top of, as much as you can, the admin side of things. So in the book, there's a musician called Hannah Peel that talks about having like a very basic Excel spreadsheet of her incomings and outgoings. And that can help you budget and plan ahead rather than get in the red because you've had an advance or a big payment for something and not budgeted it for the amount of time that it's supposed to last for. I think when artists get signed or they get a big deal, it can be really exciting and they can just assume that the money will be flowing from that moment on. But I was actually speaking to a very successful songwriter the other day who said that with her, like she was working at Starbucks for 6 to 7 years while trying to make it as a songwriter. And she could quit Starbucks after she got her first publishing deal, the advance for which was $20,000. But she had to make that last then until she was going to get the next advance. And it took like years before the ASCAP checks started to become in any way significant. And she just had to be really frugal and get roommates. And thankfully, living in Nashville at the time was quite cost effective. So she made it work. But the music business looks all shiny from the outside. You see all these musicians wearing designer clothes at the events and looking like they have a lot of money. But unless you're, in the top 1%, the reality can actually be quite different. It can actually be quite a struggle, and it's really important to keep on top of your money and make very sensible decisions, especially early on in your career, so it doesn't come to bite you later on.
Yeah, there was a great piece in Music X that we broke down on the podcast recently, and the headline was "There Has to Be a Better Way: How to Overcome Music Industry Overload." And you talk about that in the book. You talk about burnout, and there's a really great graphic I wish I could show our audience, but it talks about balance and all of that. Talk a little bit about burnout.
Yeah, so I interviewed a psychologist called Jake Lovelock, and he works with a lot of people who experience burnout. And he described how the classic case would present as somebody who's got like unmanageable amounts of work on. And so they think, okay, I'm going to start working longer hours. I'm going to cancel that drink with a friend. I'm not going to go to the gym tonight just to get the work done. And then slowly this starts to happen more and more. And what we don't realize is we think that, okay, I'll just get the work out the way and then I'll be fine. But it's those things that are bringing us balance, joy, connection that are basically the antidotes to burnout. And he was talking about why, all these things are so important. And I think the spiral sort of was showing, wasn't it? It was like, first of all, you start cancelling the drinks with friends, then you stop doing exercise, then you start having like really interrupted sleep, and then slowly you start to lose any kind of joy in any area of your life, and you start to become quite cynical. You don't get any joy from your work, and you're overall you're exhausted. So I love this idea. I mean, Jake was saying, one of the ways to try and move forward if you're in a burnout place is to actually go out in the world and try and do something that makes you feel joy. Whatever it is, any kind of activity. And he was and it seemed so simplistic, but that idea of actually, making you feel positive emotions is something that we hear a lot in positive psychology. Martin Seligman talks about this quite a lot in terms of well-being structures. So it's not new, but it's an interesting one, I think, in terms of burnout.
In the old world, artists really only had to endure occasional bad reviews. Today with social media, comment sections, the floodgates are open to copious amounts of criticism. You have a couple of chapters that cover criticism. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so this was a really important one for us to cover because, like you say, the environment that artists are working in nowadays is kind of like unlike anything that's ever been seen before in history in terms of the amount of feedback they are receiving on a often hourly basis. So I think it's really important to be aware of that and be aware of the impact that can have on mental health. Just like exercising caution with social media, it's kind of widely known that social media has been engineered to be addictive. And that if you sit there scrolling on your phone all day, you're probably not going to feel great at the end of the day. So it's a similar thing with that feedback loop. How can you practice mindfulness about being on the receiving end of it? And that's putting limits in place. If you're privileged enough to have a team to manage your social media accounts for you, that's probably a good idea. There's a great quote there for Taylor Swift in that chapter where she talks about the reasoning behind turning off comments from her posts. And also Gary Newman talks about you can read 1,000 lovely things and one nasty one, and it's the nasty one you'll be thinking about before you go to sleep. So if you go looking for praise and you're getting really excited about that validation, just be aware of the flip side of that, and what you're going to find and how that's going to make you feel. So yeah, that's the main things, I think. And then there's also, when talking about criticism, there's a difference between unhelpful criticism and helpful criticism. So a stranger on the internet telling you a random negative thing doesn't really hold much weight. They don't know who you are. It's not a comment on you personally. Who knows what motivated them to put that there? Maybe it's their taste. Maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe they're a troll who just seems to get some kind of meaning out of doing that online. So really, but criticism from people who know you and who want you to succeed, that's a different thing, and that can be really important to listen to and can have a positive impact on your career, because everyone's kind of pretty rubbish when they start out doing something, and there are people who are more experienced and just have different perspectives who might be able to help lead you in the right direction.
You explore ways to deal with fame, including quote unquote life events, this life event score. Tell us about that.
There's basically a list of life events that are said to like have major impacts on stress levels. It's things like marital separation, business readjustment, change in financial state, change to a different line of work, outstanding personal achievement, changing living conditions, change in social activities. There's various things, and they all have a score. And fame and all the things that come with it often have a lot of the things included in that list. So if you add up the stress levels of multiple factors, fame ends up being quite a stressful life event on that scoreboard. So we kind of delve into that in the chapter, and the importance of being aware of the psychological impact of becoming famous. And there's some great quotes from a clinical psychologist called Donna Rockwell, who's done a lot of research on this. And she talks about how the different stages of becoming famous, and how, you start off like having no awareness of it, and then you're thrown into it, and then you kind of start craving it and becoming addicted to all that comes with being famous. And then your brain changes to expect that level of adulation constantly. And then after that, you have to kind of adapt to the new reality, and then you accept the new way of being. And she talks really well about the importance of having a kind of strategy and awareness to help you through that process, so you don't end up getting swallowed up by the pitfalls of fame and acquiring what's called situational narcissism, which obviously isn't a very desirable personality trait, and losing touch with the people who have your best interests at heart. There's tons of quotes out there from people who've become very famous and rich and wouldn't wish it on their worst enemy. There's lots of really great advice in that chapter about how to deal with it if it happens to you, and that things like maybe having an artist moniker to separate yourself from this famous part of yourself, cherishing and nurturing relationships with family and people who will tell you the truth and keep you grounded, learning mindfulness, philanthropy, giving back, turning the attention to other people rather than yourself. So if fans are clamoring to get your attention and asking you questions and that kind of thing, one of the research participants in Donna's study said that they would turn it back on the fans and ask them about themselves. And it's just kind of reminding you that you're a human first, basically. I think that chapter's really fascinating. And fame itself is like, I always think that if I'm going to write another book, I would love to write one on the just like fame and the psychological process of fame and the impact that has on people. I think is a fascinating subject.
I've read that the music industry has a 93% failure rate if you're just looking at ROI. In your book, you talk about perspective. Failure, which you explain, isn't necessarily a negative thing, and life beyond music. Tell us about that.
I guess my only question would be, in your failure rate of 93%, like what artists were they looking at?
This is a financial thing. If you're just looking on return on investment, they see that as a 93% failure rate. Okay.
So I'd say in the UK, specifically, I can't speak for the US, but we have a fantastic, thriving, independent music scene. The ability to take your rights in your own hand in hand and actually do things on your own is really phenomenal. And I think we talk about the music industry and artists within it. Sometimes we only talk about the ones signed to major labels, and there is this enormous ecosystem of other artists out there who are doing it slightly differently. So I'd say that in terms of failure, I think sometimes those artists feel like in order to sign to a major label, they need to have that stamp of approval that they can say to everyone, I'm signed to Universal. But I've also had artists say, but I'm making X amount of profit. I own all my masters. I'm completely in control of my life. Why would I give that away? So that's just my perspective. But I think Rhian obviously wrote the failure chapter, so she may have more to say on this. But I would say in terms of life beyond music or life beyond a label, I think there are so many possibilities now that maybe in the 90s you'd be dropped and that was it, your life was over. But now people can have thriving careers into their 70s, 80s.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into what your own definition of success is. Like we quote a musician called Adam Ficek throughout the book, who is a member of a British band called Baby Shambles, and he balances that and a solo career with his with his job as a therapist, and he loves his job. Like that's such a fascinating balance for him. If someone else with a different perspective might call that failure, that you can't be a full-time musician, but for him it works out really well. So I think that's the really important thing about perspective, just knowing that again, that top 1% of musicians, it's actually really rare to reach that, but there are lots of ways of having a career in music that involve many different areas and might have an element that isn't directly in music but complements it, or there might be some music teaching involved alongside a performing career, and that's really normal, and there's nothing wrong with that, and it can actually be really healthy to have something that gives you a bit of a different perspective. Because like we were saying earlier, the music industry, it looks all glamorous on the outside, but the reality is that it's quite a tough industry, especially one to make a lot of money in. As we kind of say in the money management chapter, the average salary for a working musician in the US is $35,000, which isn't a large amount at all. And there's also a lot of kind of luck, connections, privileged involved in making it, whatever that means. So we kind of delve into that. We kind of delve into a few artist stories that just show the reality of the hard work that it takes to be able to make a full-time living from a performing career. Like there's a British band called Idols who it took them 10 years to make a living from a job they're all just doing but other jobs on the side while just trying to do gigs in the evening and then driving up to do their day jobs the next day. And it's the same story for the 1975. Like it took them kind of 11 years before releasing their debut album and hitting #1, and that's 11 years of gigging and hard work and knocking on doors and getting no's before finally getting the support of the manager that they have. So we delve into all of that. We delve into big wins early on don't necessarily mean that it will be sustained. Failures are inevitable. It's all part of the kind of the life learning process, and sometimes it's because maybe you don't have the right team, maybe it's not the right time for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not gonna happen. But I do think it's really, really important to just have like a perspective that exists beyond what is a tiny microcosm of the music industry, and realize that there's a whole big world out there that can provide some balance to your career.
Yeah, I think you point out something that I think is key, and that is that the word success is different for every artist. Some people want accolades, some want just that creative control, some want financials, some want streaming numbers or a big social footprint. So everybody sort of has their own vision of what success is. So I'd like to ask you two, for putting together this fantastic book, what is success to you as you release this out into the world?
For it to reach and help as many people as possible, and for it to be received with the intention that we wrote it.
Lucy?
With the UK launch of the book, so I do a lot of workshops for musicians. In one-on-one sessions, I'm introduced to artists. And for me, when somebody says, "Oh my goodness, you wrote sound advice. I love that book." Or, I've been meaning to get it. Yeah, it looks brilliant. Or, things like that. Like just feedback from one person that says, "That really helped me. That was great." That means a huge amount. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do. I was a musician. I studied years ago and had a lot of issues with my hands when I was playing instruments, a lot of performance anxiety. And in the early 2000s, there weren't places to go where you could actually get help. There weren't books like this. There weren't, organisations like we have in the UK, like Help Musicians and the British Association of Performing Arts Medicine, that are all set up to help musicians. And so for me, this was basically the book that I wanted to have as a musician. And so in terms of my definition of success, to know that there might be somebody out there who might be experiencing performance anxiety and might pick it up and it might suddenly feel a bit easier, or they might be having hand pain when they're playing an instrument and they'll go to the resources section and they'll say, "Hey, I know where to go now. I know how to actually get, to get checked up for this and get the right support." And that's my definition of success.
As we wrap up, where can people learn more about you both? Where can they learn more about the book?
I mean, I'm on social media, and I've also got a website for my journalism work, which is rhianjones.com or .co. I think it's .co.uk, and that's RHIAN. And the book is at soundadvicebook.com. There's a lot of information about it there. We will get a pre-order link soon for the international edition that's released on November the 14th. But in the meantime, there's a box where you can sign up to our mailing list and put your email in, and you will get an email as soon as we have that pre-order link, and for any news about the book in the meantime.
What about you, Lucy?
I'm on Instagram, Lucy Heyman Music, and also like LinkedIn. So, if anyone wants to connect and discuss anything, always really open to that. And it's Lucy Heyman, Heyman.
Congratulations on a fantastic book. It was so lovely meeting both of you. Continued success.
Thank you so much, Dave.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.